So picture this. It's roughly 261 BCE, and the most powerful man on Earth has just won a massive war.
Right.
He is standing over the bodies of something like 100,000 dead soldiers.
Which is just a completely staggering number of casualties for the ancient world.
Oh, absolutely. It's apocalyptic. But then he decides to do something that, as far as we know, no ancient conqueror had ever done before.
Yeah.
He apologized.
He really did.
And not just, a private whispered regret to some priest in a dark room. He literally carved his remorse into solid rock across the entire length and breadth of the Indian subcontinent.
For his subjects, his enemies, and basically all of future history to read.
Exactly. So welcome to today's deep dive. Today we are looking at the Maurya Empire. We're tracking the story of ancient India's first truly massive unified state, which flourished from roughly 322 to 185 BCE.
It is such a fascinating era to unpack.
It really is. Yeah. And the source notes we have for this deep dive are incredibly layered. On one hand, we are digging into the hard logistical facts. How do you actually build an empire that stretches from modern-day Afghanistan all the way to Bangladesh?
Right, the real nuts and bolts of statecraft.
But on the other hand, the notes provide this really fascinating, almost modern psychological framework. They use this reflective persona named Tira, and even use contemporary musical metaphors to map out the emotional and philosophical evolution of this civilization.
Which is a totally unique way to look at ancient history.
I thought so too. So our mission today is to uncover how the Mauryas shifted from this pure, unsentimental brute force to a profound moral self-awareness. And I guess what that civilizational pivot reveals about how we human beings organize ourselves.
The transition from the sword to the rock edict, it isn't just a historical curiosity. It actually challenges our fundamental assumptions about statecraft. Well, we typically study empires as these vast, predatory organisms, right? They expand and expand until they hit a geographic or a military wall, and then eventually they collapse.
Like Rome or Alexander the Great's empire.
Exactly. But the Mauryan state, they hit a moral wall.
Wow.
Yeah. But to understand how an empire can even afford the luxury of a moral awakening, you first have to understand the brutal, calculated mechanics that made it a superpower in the first place.
Right. You can't just jump straight to the philosophy.
No, you don't get to preach nonviolence unless you have first entirely monopolized violence.
Man, that is a heavy thought, but it makes perfect sense. And that brings us to, I guess, the dirt and the borders, the geography of ambition.
Let's get into it.
So before a civilization can ask these big philosophical questions, it has to eat. It has to survive. The Maurya Empire started in a kingdom called Magadha,
which was centered in the Middle Gangetic Plain.
Yeah, near modern-day Patna in Bihar. And if you were looking to build a continental superpower from scratch, Magadha is basically the ultimate ancient startup incubator.
That's a great way to put it.
I mean, it had this crazy confluence of natural advantages that essentially forced it to become wealthy. It wasn't just that the alluvial soil was fertile.
Right. It was the specific capacity to generate massive, highly reliable agricultural surpluses.
Exactly. Because if you want to have a standing army or a huge urban class of bureaucrats who don't farm, somebody else has to grow a lot of extra food.
Because empires do not eat philosophy, they eat grain.
I love that quote from the notes. They eat grain.
It's the absolute truth. The Ganges Basin provided the caloric foundation, but the river system itself provided the circulatory system.
Meaning transport, right?
Yes. In 300 BCE, moving grain or moving troops overland is agonizingly slow and astronomically expensive.
Right, carts and oxen getting stuck in the mud.
Exactly. But the Ganges, the Yamuna, and their tributaries, they functioned as these nearly frictionless highways.
But the notes highlight that Magadha's true geographical advantage wasn't just water and dirt. It was access to the eastern forests.
Oh, the timber and the elephants.
Yes. The timber was for massive urban fortifications, but the forests provided a localized monopoly on what was basically the ultimate weapon of ancient warfare, the Indian elephant.
And we really need to emphasize how terrifying war elephants actually were.
Yeah, please do. Because I feel like they just get tossed around in history books like they were just, I don't know, ancient heavy artillery.
Right, like catapults or something. But they weren't just machines. They were living, breathing, psychological weapons.
Just try to imagine standing in a tightly packed infantry formation. You're holding a spear, and you feel the ground literally shaking beneath your feet.
Through the dust, you just see this 4-ton animal charging at you at 20 miles an hour.
Trumpeting, covered in armor, with guys shooting arrows off its back.
It breaks the mind of a soldier long before it ever breaks the physical line.
That is terrifying.
The psychological terror was the primary function. Horses will naturally refuse to charge a wall of elephants. They just won't do it. And untrained infantry will just break and run.
So Magadha just cornered the market on these things.
Basically, yeah. The Magadhan kings realized this early on, and they instituted these incredibly strict state monopolies on trapping and training wild elephants.
The Keta system, right?
Yes, the Keta system. They would corral entire wild herds, isolate the strongest males, and break them for military service.
Wow.
So when the founder of the empire, Chandragupta Maurya, overthrows the Nanda dynasty around 321 BCE to claim Magadha, he just inherits this immense, fully functioning military-industrial complex.
And he takes this localized powerhouse and he just pushes the borders out. He unifies vast stretches of the subcontinent.
He transforms what was just regional dominance into true continental imperial rule.
But here is where the source notes highlight this completely staggering detail about Chandragupta's later life.
It's one of the most incredible contrasts in history.
It really is. So he spends decades using absolute force, using these terrifying elephant armies and strategic cunning to build this massive empire. But then later Jain traditions say he just gave it all up.
He abdicated his throne.
Right. He hands the keys to the empire to his son, he travels south into Karnataka, and he becomes a Jain ascetic.
He engaged in a practice called salakana.
Which is basically fasting to death.
Yes. It's a systematic detachment from the material world. You slowly stop eating and drinking until you pass away.
It just forces us to confront the duality of this guy.
Yeah.
I mean, the builder of one of the most materially dominant states in human history concludes his life by deciding that material dominance is ultimately totally empty.
He strips away his royal titles, his silks, his food, his water. He reduces his existence to zero.
It's mind-blowing. But the kicker is, while Chandragupta was starving himself in a cave down south, the bureaucratic machine he left behind up north was just ruthlessly expanding.
It was standardizing and consuming everything in its path.
Because an empire of that size, it can't just run on the founder's charisma forever.
No, it needs an operating system.
Right, an operating system.
Yeah.
And that system was engineered by Chandragupta's chief advisor, a guy named Chanakya, who is also known as Kautilya.
Kautilya is a fascinating figure. He is the author, or at least the primary mastermind, behind a text called the Arthashastra.
Which translates to what? The science of wealth?
The science of wealth and the science of politics. Basically, if Chandragupta was the muscle, Kautilya was the architect of the surveillance state.
And the Arthashastra is just, it's a masterclass in political realism, isn't it?
Completely. It is totally unsentimental. It's devoid of any religious idealism, and it is singularly focused on the preservation and the expansion of state power.
He outlines this thing called the Saptanga theory, right?
Yes, the 7 limbs of the state. It prioritizes the king, the treasury, and the army above all else.
Okay, sure. But the brilliance of the text, at least from what I read in the notes, is its absolute obsession with micromanagement.
Oh, it is incredibly detailed.
Like, it doesn't just offer vague Sun Tzu-style philosophical advice. It dictates the exact standard weights and measures to be used in the local markets.
It dictates the widths of the roads,
The salaries of specific government clerks, and the exact taxation rates for different types of irrigated land.
It leaves nothing to chance.
Let's talk about how this actually functioned on the ground. Because running a massive surveillance state in antiquity without computers or phones sounds physically impossible.
You would think so. But Kautilya's text outlines an entire shadow economy of espionage.
It's wild. You have spy networks that are so deeply embedded there, literally spying on other spies.
Exactly. The intelligence apparatus was categorized into stationary spies and wandering spies.
What's a wandering spy doing?
Well, you had agents disguised as merchants, for example. They would operate in the bazaars just to monitor the fluctuating prices of grain.
Oh, so they're looking for signs of economic unrest or maybe merchants grouping together to fix prices.
Precisely. Guild collusion. And then you had female spies embedded in the households of high-ranking ministers just to listen to their pillow talk.
Why?
You had ascetics and monks sitting outside temples secretly gathering the grievances of the common people.
And all this info is just flowing back to the capital.
Relayed via a massive network of runners, directly back to the king. Kautilya's philosophy was that the king must know the internal state of his empire better than he knows his own mind.
Because trust is a vulnerability.
Exactly. Trust is a weakness.
The text even gets into the mechanics of royal paranoia, which I found fascinating. It advises the king to constantly change his bedroom.
Never sleep in the same place twice.
Right, and to have this highly regimented system for testing food for poison, like observing how the flames react when you throw a sample of the king's dinner into the fire.
It's extreme paranoia, but institutionalized.
But let me push back on the framing of this for a second, because academics often describe Kautilya's system as this grand achievement in, quote, preventing chaos.
Sure.
And our source notes say this wasn't about individual liberty, it was about imperial coherence. But honestly, doesn't imperial coherence just sound like a really polite euphemism for a totalitarian nightmare?
It certainly does to modern ears, yes.
Like, if you ask a local weaver who's being closely monitored by some state spy just to ensure he isn't underreporting his daily output, I highly doubt that guy cares about the coherence of the empire.
No, you're touching on the fundamental critique of the Mauryan state. The individual subject in the Arthashastra is entirely subordinate to the treasury.
Right. You're just a cog in the wealth machine.
But we have to evaluate Kautilya's logic within the context of the Iron Age.
Okay, fair enough.
Because the alternative to this totalitarian control wasn't a liberal democracy. The alternative was complete fragmentation. It was warlordism and endemic violence.
A power vacuum.
Exactly. When the central authority collapses in an ancient agrarian society, the irrigation canals break down, the trade routes become plagued by bandits, and famine immediately follows.
So Kautilya would argue that the heavy taxation and the constant surveillance were just the necessary price you pay for a stable food supply.
And protection from arbitrary violence. The state was a machine designed to manufacture stability, and machines do not care about individual liberties.
Wow. So the justification is essentially just the prevention of the Habesian War of all against all.
Exactly.
The Mauryans chose the iron fist because the open hand gets cut off.
That's a very Kautilyan way of thinking.
And they really needed that iron fist because they were expanding right into a completely chaotic global stage.
The post-Alexandrian world.
Right. By the late 4th century BCE, the geopolitical map had been completely rewritten by Alexander the Great. And after Alexander died in 323 BCE, his generals basically carved up his massive territory into all these Hellenistic kingdoms.
And one of his most capable commanders, Seleucus I Nicator, established the Seleucid Empire.
Which was huge, right?
Massive. It stretched from modern-day Syria all the way to the borders of India.
And Seleucus naturally wanted to reclaim the eastern territories, like the Punjab and the Indus Valley, that Alexander had briefly conquered.
But when he marched his armies east, around 305 BCE, he was in for a massive shock.
He didn't find those fragmented, quarreling Indian kings that Alexander fought.
No. He collided directly with the centralized, fully mobilized, heavily armored war machine of Chandragupta Maurya.
So these two massive empires clash.
Oh.
But the fascinating part to me is how quickly both sides realized that a prolonged war of attrition would just destroy them both.
They were both incredibly pragmatic leaders.
Right. Instead of an endless bloodbath, we get one of the most amazing diplomatic treaties of the ancient world.
It's brilliant geopolitics.
They sit down at the table. Seleucus agrees to cede an enormous amount of territory. We're talking modern-day Afghanistan, Balochistan, parts of Pakistan, basically shifting the Mauryan border all the way up to the Hindu Kush Mountains.
Which is a massive territorial concession.
Huge. And in exchange, what does Chandragupta give him? 500 war elephants.
I always try to picture the logistics of that exchange.
I know, right?
Walking 500 living, breathing elephants across the mountains of Afghanistan so they can be deployed in the battlefields of the Mediterranean world.
It is an absurd feat of biological engineering and diplomacy.
And those elephants actually proved totally decisive for Seleucus at the Battle of Ipsus a few years later.
So it was a win-win. Geopolitics has a high-stakes trade negotiation. You give me ancient Afghanistan, I give you 500 ancient tanks.
Exactly. And this treaty wasn't just a temporary truce. It was the establishment of a hard border and a lasting diplomatic relationship.
They even set up marriage alliances, right?
Most likely, yes. And they opened up the primary trade arteries connecting the Ganges to the Mediterranean.
Which brings a lot of cross-cultural contact. We know this connection was deep because the Seleucids sent an ambassador to live in the Mauryan capital.
A Greek diplomat named Megasthenes.
Right, and he lived in the capital, Pataliputra, and wrote this huge account called the Indica.
Now, the original text of the Indica is lost, unfortunately, but later Greek and Roman historians quoted it extensively. So it gives us this incredible window into how an outsider someone steeped in Greek political traditions, viewed this Indian superpower.
And what did he think?
He was completely mesmerized by the sheer scale of the operation. He describes Pataliputra as this massive city shaped like a parallelogram, sitting right at the confluence of the Ganges and the Sun rivers.
And it was heavily fortified, I imagine.
Oh, surrounded by a massive wooden palisade with 64 gates and 570 watchtowers.
That's insane.
He also details the municipal government. He says it was divided into 6 boards of 5 members each.
Micromanagement again.
Exactly. They oversaw everything from the care of foreign dignitaries to the registration of births and deaths, all the way to collecting a 10% sales tax on manufactured goods.
It's like Kautilya's Arthashastra come to life.
Yes, his observations confirm Kautilya's theories were actually put into practice. The state was heavily intervening in daily life.
Although the notes point out Megasthenes famously got a few things wrong, right?
He did. He claimed there was no slavery in India, which was likely a misunderstanding.
Because he was comparing it to the brutal chattel slavery back in Greece.
Right. India had different tiers of bonded labor, which to a Greek observer might not have looked like traditional slavery. He also divided Indian society into 7 occupational classes, rather than the traditional 4 varnas.
Oh, so he was looking at the functional reality of the guilds and professions rather than what the theological text said.
Exactly. He was observing what people actually did for a living.
He also described the king's interactions with the public, which sounded totally bizarre.
Highly choreographed.
Yeah. He describes royal processions where the king would emerge surrounded by female bodyguards with attendants carrying trees.
Yeah.
And the trees had live birds trained to sing in them.
It was pure theatricality, a projection of divine opulence masking intense paranoia.
Okay, so the machine is fully operational, the borders are secured by the Hindu Kush Mountains, the economy is fueled by this hyper-monitored agricultural base, trade routes are pumping Hellenistic silver into the treasury.
The Mauryan state under Chandragupta and then his son Bindusara has absolutely mastered the art of extraction and control.
But then, Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka, takes the throne.
And this is where the perfect cold machine hits the limits of human psychology.
Right, so Ashoka's early reign was entirely conventional, wasn't it?
Very much so. He was a pure product of the Arthashastra system.
He fought a war of succession against his own brothers just to secure the throne.
And he looked to expand the borders even further. His primary target was the Kingdom of Kalinga,
which is located on the eastern seaboard of India in modern-day Odisha. And Kalinga wasn't just some random target for ego or glory. It was an economic imperative for the empire.
because Kalinga controlled the vital maritime trade routes to Southeast Asia.
Right, they had these incredibly lucrative coastal ports.
Yeah.
And for a state that is completely obsessed with controlling all the wealth, leaving a prosperous, independent maritime power right on your border is just intolerable.
So around 261 BCE, Ashoka marches on Kalinga.
And the Mauryan military machine performs exactly as Kautilya designed it to. Ashoka won.
He won definitively, but the scale of the victory was completely horrific.
This is the turning point.
Yes. In his own 13th major rock edict, Ashoka actually drops the propaganda of typical ancient kings, and he openly admits the staggering human cost of what he did.
Which is so rare.
He claims that 150,000 people were deported, 100,000 were killed in battle, and many times that number perished from the ensuing famine and disease.
I just want to pause and think about the logistics of 150,000 deportations in the ancient world.
It's hard to even fathom.
You are tearing entire populations away from their ancestral lands, marching them hundreds of miles under armed guard, the death toll among the young and the elderly on those marches. It would have been catastrophic.
Utterly brutal.
And Ashoka is standing at the epicenter of this engineered apocalypse, and he breaks.
It is arguably the single most documented crisis of conscience in ancient political history.
What does he actually say in the edict?
He states that the conquest of an unconquered country entails slaughter, death, and deportation. And he says this is considered very painful and deplorable by the beloved of the gods, which is how he referred to himself.
So he publicly declares that he is abandoning the traditional policy of Digvijaya.
Yes, Digvijaya, which means military conquest. And he replaces it with Dhamma Vijaya.
Meaning conquest through righteousness or moral duty.
Exactly.
Okay, this is where our source notes introduce a deeply fascinating, really modern psychological framework to help us understand this ancient pivot.
The Tira persona.
Right. The author of the notes uses this persona named Tira as a lens. And Tira represents this quiet, internal weaving of meaning out of profound pain.
It's a way to conceptualize moving from trauma to understanding.
Exactly. The notes describe this persona moving from isolation and the stigma of all that violence toward a state of real self-articulation. They even use modern musical tracks as metaphors for this journey.
Which is such an interesting choice.
Right. They cite songs like Cursed Eye, Last Train Home, and Ode to Diary.
And just to clarify for everyone, the Mauryans were obviously not listening to modern indie soundtracks.
No, definitely not.
The author of our sources is using these specific musical themes as an emotional shorthand.
Okay, let's unpack that. How do those songs map onto Ashoka's experience?
Well, Cursed Eye represents the trauma of seeing the world through the lens of Kalinga. It's the inability to unsee the suffering that you yourself have caused.
Oh, wow. That burden of witnessing your own destruction.
Right. Then Last Train Home captures the exhaustion of the conqueror. It's that sudden realization that the empire just cannot continue down the tracks of endless extraction and bloodshed.
The machine has to stop.
And finally, Ode to Diary represents the rock edicts themselves.
Carving your diary into stone.
Exactly. The desperate need to articulate this new internal reality and to carve your private reflections into the public sphere.
The notes actually call this Tira persona the prep cook of the inner world. And I found that metaphor incredibly grounded.
It really is.
Because a prep cook does all the invisible, unglamorous work, right? Chopping the vegetables, simmering the stock, all so that the final dish can come together.
They lay the foundation.
Right. Chandragupta and Kautilya, they were the prep cooks of the physical world. They built the roads, the tax ledgers, the supply chains. But Ashoka, by adopting this Tira-like reflection, he realized that a civilization needs more than just roads and grain.
It needs a moral infrastructure.
Yes. It needs the prep work of empathy, restraint, and tolerance to hold a wildly diverse population together without just holding a knife to their throats all the time.
And how Ashoka manifested this moral infrastructure is really vital to understand, because he didn't dismantle the army. He didn't scrap the tax system.
And he didn't step down and starve himself in a cave like his grandfather did.
No, he remained the absolute ruler. Instead, he attempted to reprogram the operating system from the inside out. He introduced the concept of dhamma.
Now, dhamma is a complex word, isn't it?
Very. It's a Prakrit word derived from the Sanskrit dharma. And while Ashoka himself was personally drawn to Buddhism, his imperial dhamma was not some sectarian religious doctrine that he forced upon his subjects.
It wasn't like everyone must convert to Buddhism now.
Not at all. It was more of a universalized ethical code.
Essentially a civic religion based on behavioral restraint.
Exactly. His edicts preached respect for parents and teachers, generosity toward friends and ascetics, humane treatment of servants and enslaved people.
Had a really drastic reduction in the slaughter of animals, right?
Yes. He even established medical facilities for both humans and animals. He planted shade trees and dug wells along all the major trade routes.
Which is incredible for the 3rd century BCE.
Mm-hmm.
But the mechanism of broadcasting this dhamma is an engineering marvel in itself.
The rock edicts and the pillars.
Right. Ashoka commissioned the carving of his edicts into massive rock faces near border towns and pilgrimage sites, and eventually onto these monumental freestanding sandstone pillars.
These pillars were unbelievable. They were quarried primarily in Chunar, and some of them weighed up to 50 tons.
To 50 tons. And they polished them to a glass-like finish, using techniques we still don't fully understand today.
And then they transported them hundreds of miles, likely strapped to specialized river barges during the monsoon floods.
So you go to all this effort to carve a universal message. But you have a fiercely diverse empire. Ashoka didn't try to flatten the identities of his people into a single Mauryan monoculture, did he?
No, he was actually incredibly pragmatic about it. He embraced the layered identities of his subjects.
The notes point out a brilliant example of this with the Kandahar bilingual rock edict in modern-day Afghanistan.
One of my favorites.
He didn't carve it in the Indian Prakrit language. He carved it in Greek and Aramaic.
Because that's what the people living there spoke.
Right. He tailored the philosophical concept to the local audience. He translated his concept of dhamma into the Greek concept of euspeia, which means piety or reverence.
He was literally meeting his subjects where they were, intellectually and linguistically.
But he didn't just carve rocks and hope for the best. He actually created a bureaucracy to enforce it.
True. He recognized that true imperial coherence couldn't just rely on Kautilya's spies anymore. It needed ideological buy-in.
So he created a new cadre of bureaucrats called the Dhamma Mahamatras,
Yeah.
the officers of Dhamma.
They were essentially moral auditors. They traveled the empire to ensure that local officials were not being overly harsh, to promote social harmony among different religious sects, and to manage charitable endowments.
Okay, you say moral auditors, but let's look at this critically for a second.
Yeah.
If a government agent shows up in your village to ensure you are being properly respectful and harmonious, that still carries the implicit threat of state violence, right?
Oh, undoubtedly.
It's a kinder, gentler surveillance, maybe, but it is still surveillance. The state is now monitoring not just your grain output, but your moral conduct.
That is the ultimate paradox of Ashoka's reign. He was promoting nonviolence, yet he still maintained the power of life and death. In fact, his edicts implicitly warn the unconquered forest tribes not to rebel. He explicitly reminds them that the emperor still wields power despite his remorse.
Basically, I'm sorry, but don't test me.
Exactly. And furthermore, we have to look at the material reality of this philosophical pivot.
The cost.
Yes. Ashoka's massive public works, transporting 50-ton pillars, building medical centers, giving endowments to thousands of Buddhist monks, all of that was incredibly expensive.
So the duality of life in the empire becomes very stark here. You have the cosmopolitan elite in the capital debating Buddhist philosophy, and you have Greek diplomats reading bilingual edicts about cosmic harmony.
But what about the farmers?
Right. The vast majority of the population lived in small agricultural villages. Their lives were entirely dictated by the monsoon cycles, planting wheat, rice, lentils.
To them, the state wasn't a philosophical entity. The state was the tax collector.
And under Ashoka, that tax burden did not disappear, did it?
Not at all. The villagers still paid the baga, the royal share of the produce, which was usually 1/6, but could easily be higher.
And they still paid the udakabaga, the water tax, for using state irrigation.
And they provided forced labor, or vishti, for public works.
So those magnificent 50-ton pillars preaching compassion and nonviolence, they were ultimately funded by the sweat of overtaxed agrarian laborers.
The moral awakening at the top of the pyramid is always heavy on the bottom.
That is profound. Which brings us to the ultimate test of this whole system. Ashoka manages to balance the immense bureaucratic weight of Kautilya's machine with this new ideological glue of dhamma.
He even engages in early soft power.
Oh, right. Sending emissaries and monks to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and even the courts of the Hellenistic kings, like Antiochus and Ptolemy.
He really tries to weave a global moral network.
But after Ashoka dies around 232 BCE, this beautifully balanced complex structure just begins to slowly unravel.
It falls apart.
Why? I mean, if you have the perfect bureaucracy and a unifying moral code that everyone respects, why does the empire fall?
Because the system was fatally over-centralized.
Oh, because of Kautilya's design.
Exactly. The Arthashastra model assumes a genius at the center of the web. It requires a king with an infinite capacity for work, someone who can process vast streams of intelligence and manage massive expenditures daily.
And Ashoka's successors just couldn't handle it.
They simply did not have his or Chandragupta's administrative stamina. And when the center weakens, the provinces inevitably assert their autonomy.
And we actually see the economic strain in the archaeological record, don't we?
We do. The later Mauryan kings began debasing the currency.
Right. The silver punch-marked coins start showing a much higher copper content.
The treasury was drying up. You have a massive standing army, a continent-spanning network of spies, and a huge cadre of dhamma mahamatras all drawing state salaries.
And without the constant influx of wealth from new military conquests, the maintenance costs of the empire just exceeded its revenues.
They ran out of money, but it wasn't a catastrophic collapse.
Right, there was no dramatic, fiery apocalypse.
There was no single barbarian invasion that burned Pataliputra to the ground. It was administrative asphyxiation.
Regional governors in the northwest and the south realized the capital couldn't enforce its will anymore, so they just stopped sending taxes.
The empire just contracted back toward its Magadhan core.
Until finally, in 185 BCE, the last Mauryan emperor, Brihadratha, is inspecting his troops.
And he is assassinated right there on the parade ground by his own commander-in-chief, a man named Pushyamitra Shunga.
And Pushyamitra founds the Shunga dynasty. But it's a much smaller regional power. The subcontinent fragments back into a multipolar system of competing kingdoms.
The Mauryan machine doesn't shatter violently like glass. It just dissolves.
Like a tight muscle finally relaxing when the tension is gone.
That's exactly it. But the memory of what they built, that idea that the Indian subcontinent could be a larger political and civilizational whole that never vanishes,
The structural legacy is profound. I mean, the Mauryans laid the arterial trade routes that basically define South Asian commerce to this very day.
But their symbolic legacy is unmatched.
Yeah, talk about that. When the modern Republic of India achieved independence in 1947, what happened?
Well, they needed symbols to represent a newly unified, diverse nation,
Hmm.
and they didn't choose the weapons of Chandragupta.
Yeah.
They chose the lion capital of Ashoka, the 4 lions standing back to back that originally sat atop his pillar at Sarnath.
And in the very center of the Indian national flag is the Ashoka Chakra.
The 24-spoked wheel representing the eternal law of dhamma.
It's just wild to think about. The highest ideals of a modern democracy are directly anchored in the remorse and the philosophical prep work of an Iron Age emperor.
It is an incredible legacy.
We have traced such a massive arc today. We started with the fertile dirt of Magadha, where Chandragupta and Kautilya engineered this terrifyingly efficient, unsentimental surveillance state.
We saw them leverage geography, state monopolies, and war elephants to violently bind a whole continent together.
And then we saw Ashoka, completely shattered by the trauma of Kalinga, utilize that exact same bureaucratic infrastructure to broadcast a universal message of empathy and restraint.
Through the psychological lens of the source's Tira persona, we explored how a state can transition from the isolation of brute force to the true articulation of meaning.
They proved that you can build an empire with swords and spies, but you can only achieve civilizational immortality through the creation of a moral vocabulary.
They dared to ask not just how to rule people, but how people ought to live with one another.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want you, listening right now, to reflect on the architecture of your own life.
That's a great exercise.
We all construct our own internal systems to survive and succeed, right? So are you operating purely on the Kautilya model right now? Are you ruthlessly expanding, optimizing every single hour, surveilling your own productivity, and just justifying the sheer exhaustion as the necessary price of preventing chaos?
Or are you taking the time to engage in the quiet, Tira-like prep work of your inner world?
Exactly. Are you pausing after a hard victory to weave empathy, reflection, and a personal dhamma into the way you interact with the people around you?
Because a system that focuses exclusively on extraction and control will inevitably debase its own currency.
Whether that currency is ancient silver or your own mental well-being.
Survival is the prerequisite for philosophy, but it cannot be the ultimate goal.
That is so well said. To close out today, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. Consider the sheer audacity of Ashoka's 13th rock edict. Think about the mechanics of power in our own time today.
Power today almost always seeks to insulate itself.
Right. Power, by its very nature, seeks to avoid accountability. It obfuscates, it justifies, it spins the narrative. Yet here we have an absolute monarch from the 3rd century BCE, a man who possessed a total unchecked monopoly on violence, a man who won his war definitively.
He had no strategic reason to apologize.
None. And instead of writing a propagandistic history of his glory, he ordered stonemasons to carve his deepest psychological crisis and his profound apologies into the bedrock of the earth, ensuring that all his descendants would read of his shame.
It takes immense courage.
It really does. So if an ancient warlord with unchecked power could find the profound courage to publicly articulate his remorse and entirely reform his system, what does it say about the fragility of our modern leaders and institutions today, who, with all our advanced philosophical frameworks, almost never find the strength to simply stand up and say, "I was wrong"?